Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing the controversial decision made by Professor Stephen Hawking to boycott the President's Conference in Jerusalem, and this only plays into the hands of the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, whose whole aim is to delegitimize the State of Israel. We'll be discussing the academic boycott and what are the dangers for Israel and academic freedom, and what is really behind this boycott, and we'll also be discussing the incredible achievements made in the field of medical science and technology made by the State of Israel, which we're all benefiting. And my guests today are Alan Johnson, who is the editor of Fathom magazine and a research fellow at BICOM, and Luke Akehurst, We Believe in Israel. Alan, it's great to have you back on the Middle East Report. You did a superb job with the analysis of Syria, so it's great to have you on today. What are the challenges that you faced as a senior researcher, that obviously working for an organisation that's pro-Israel, and also a magazine that advocates Israel in the realm of academia?
I think one of the challenges we face at BICOM is that I think we're playing catch-up with the anti-Israel camp. They've been very active for several decades now in academia, with books, which then filter down into magazines, newspaper reports, and generations of students really who've heard a very slanted and distorted view of what the conflict is about. There's an expression, 90% of success is turning up. I think we're turning up in more numbers now. We believe in Israel being a great example of that, but we need to keep on doing that. I think the other challenge we have is that one of the things that's happened over the last, say, 30 years is that the anti-Israel camp have provided people with a whole framework for thinking. And they've used a series of terms such as apartheid state, ethnic cleansing, racist state, settler colonialism. The concepts go on, and they provide a kind of prison, really, in which people find it quite hard to escape, especially young students who maybe don't know too much about the Middle East, and they're very deferential to their lecturers, understandably, and they get caught inside this prison. And that's one of the challenges that Fathom has, is to develop a new historical understanding, a new theoretical framework, a new way for thinking about Israel, so that people move off that demonization agenda and they move on to an agenda of peace, coexistence, and resolving the conflict.
Excellent. I mean, I have downloaded a copy of Fathom on my phone, which is very, very good, and you can get that from the App Store. And Luke, it's great to have you back on the Middle East Report. It must be about a year since we last did a programme together on the Co-op's decision to boycott Israeli produce. Can you give us an update on the situation facing Co-op and a bit more about the work you're doing for We Believe in Israel?
Well, we've been very busy on with the Co-op. Again, as Alan said, there's a slight element of playing catch-up, because the boycott campaign has been working very hard for 10 years, and we can't expect to turn around their policy achievement in just a couple of years. We've been encouraging ordinary members of the public to get involved in the Co-op's democratic structures. So people have spoken out against the boycott up and down the country at Co-op regional and area meetings. The most recent round of those is going on at the moment. And we've done things like, when the Co-op wouldn't meet us to discuss their policy, we turned up outside their headquarters with a colleague from the Board of Deputies of British Jews dressed as a Jaffa orange, which kind of took the sting out of our protests and made it clear that it was a friendly one. And actually just turning up and being there meant that we did get the meeting that we wanted to discuss some of our concerns about where their policy was headed. We think we've probably drawn a line in the sand, and that the boycott campaigners are pushing for further Israeli companies to be blacklisted. We think our presence and our activity is going to stop that. But then the boycotters are now looking at other supermarket chains and trying to extend the boycott. They're particularly targeting Sainsbury's. So if any viewers hold shares in Sainsbury's, then they should go along to the Sainsbury's AGM, just because we have a suspicion that boycott campaigners are going to turn up there and push their case. In terms of the wider work that we've been doing, we were obviously very active during Operation Pillar of Defence, encouraging people to write to their members of parliament and make clear that Israel had the right to defend itself. And then after that operation, we did a letter writing campaign to the General Secretary of the Unite Trade Union, because we thought he issued a statement that was virtually pro-Hamas, and he actually retracted or distanced himself from some of the things he had earlier said because of pressure from members of the public that we had encouraged to write to him. It hasn't all been reactive either. We're really on the front foot on a couple of things. So one of the areas we're concerned about is boycott activity in local government. So rather than wait for boycotters to start moving in on different councils, we've contacted every councillor in the country and built up a substantial mailing list of several hundred councillors who, of all political parties and from councils all around the country, who are happy to identify themselves with support for Israel, which I think is fantastic. And then on the horizon, in terms of positive activity, we're playing our part in mobilising people for the Closer to Israel parade on the 2nd of June in central London, which is the Jewish community's celebration of the 65th anniversary of the foundation of the State of Israel. But anyone that supports Israel is welcome to come along on the 2nd of June and show their support. It should be a very positive, uplifting event. It's not primarily political, it's more a celebration of the cultural link with Israel.
Excellent, and our viewers can get that from your website, We Believe in Israel.
Exactly, yeah.
Superb. Okay, we've got a news clip to go to now, and this clip's on Professor Stephen Hawking's controversial decision to actually boycott a conference organised by the Israeli President Shimon Peres, and this is this clip right now.
Renowned British professor Stephen Hawking has given his backing to an academic boycott of Israel by pulling out of a conference hosted by Israeli President Shimon Peres in another high-profile protest of Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Hawking had accepted an invitation to headline a June Science and Technology Conference in Jerusalem. The event, called Facing Tomorrow, will profile Israel's view of the future and is expected to attract thousands of participants and international dignitaries. According to a statement by the British Committee for the Universities in Palestine, last week Hawking wrote a brief letter to Peres saying he had changed his mind. The BCUIP statement said Hawking had chosen to respect the boycott based on his knowledge of Palestine and on the unanimous advice of his own academic contacts there. Israel Maimon, the chairman of the presidential conference, said of Hawking, "The use of an academic boycott against Israel is outrageous and improper, particularly for those to whom the spirit of liberty is the basis of the human and academic mission." Hawking is a world-renowned theoretical physicist at the University of Cambridge and one of the best-known scientists and television personalities in the world. He was even tapped to participate in the opening of the 2012 London Olympics. He has traveled to Israel 4 times in the past and, according to news reports, is suffering from poor health. In April, the Teachers' Union of Ireland became the first European Lecturers Association to call for an academic boycott of Israel. America's Association for Asian American Studies has also voted to support a boycott and is the first national academic group to have done so. A don at the world-renowned Cambridge University, Hawking joins a small but growing list of English intellectuals and show business personalities who have turned down invitations to visit Israel. Among Britons boycotting Israel over Palestine are the pop performers Elvis Costello, Roger Waters, Brian Eno, and Annie Lennox.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alan, what do you make of Professor Hawking's decision to boycott Israel and strengthen the boycott, divestment and sanction campaign against Israel?
I think the decision is wrong. I think it's serious. I think it's very counterproductive. And I'd also say it's hypocritical in the extreme. It's serious. I think we should register that this is not a pop star. It's not the same thing as when Bono would say he's not going to perform, or Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. This is someone who doesn't just have immense intellectual authority around the world for his achievements in science, but in particular for the way that he's overcome his own personal difficulties, has some moral authority too. So I think it's a serious ratcheting up of the pressure on Israel and the isolation that people would like to impose upon it. It's very counterproductive. I think what we know is that dialogue works, engagement works. If what you're really aiming for is peace and peaceful coexistence and some kind of normalization of the relations between the two parties who must come to an agreement. By breaking off those links, what actually happens, ironically, is that the very people who are most interested in peace, the writers, the academics, the artists, the trade unionists, are often the ones targeted by the BDS campaigners. I think it's also particularly hypocritical in the sense that why we do have to ask the question, why is it that this is the only country that Stephen Hawking seems he needs to boycott? For instance, he went to China. Now, China has its own gulag system, in other words, a prison camp system for dissidents, something like the old Soviet Union, the old communist system. It has an occupation of Tibet, which is ongoing. It has a barbaric, in my view, one-child policy also. He was very comfortable to go to China. He went to Iran. Now, Iran, we know, again, targets and murders dissidents. It hangs gay people in great numbers. Its human rights record is absolutely appalling. But he had no problem going there. Now, Shlomo Avineri, who's an Israeli academic, also a professor, he wrote an article in Haaretz, and he used some very harsh words, which were, he did say there's a whiff of racism about this. Now, they're harsh words, but it's up for Stephen Hawking to tell us, how come Israel's the Jewish state is the only country in the world that you feel you need to boycott? And that's really for him to answer.
Luke, what's your reaction to Stephen Hawking's decision to boycott Israel?
I think it's very distressing and disappointing. As Alan said, he's a man with a great deal of moral authority and clearly a huge intellect, but he hasn't thought through what this means, either in terms of whether it does anything to promote peace, whether it actually helps the Palestinians at all, which is what he's purporting to do, and as Alan eloquently expressed it then, whether it's morally consistent to target Israel, which at the end of the day is the only democracy in the Middle East, is a country with civil liberties and a free press and very, very democratic elections, perhaps more democratic than we have here in the UK. It's an unusual target to pick for this kind of an extreme political campaign. And I think Professor Hawking needs to think about who he's alongside in this boycott campaign, because some of the people at the heart of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement are political extremists, either from the anti-democratic far left or the anti-democratic Islamist right. And I don't think that he ought to be associating with that kind of campaign. I think there are far more positive ways that he could intervene in the Middle East if he genuinely cares about the welfare of people in the region. He could have made a positive contribution by going to the conference and saying the things that he believes in, rather than by boycotting it.
And yes, Alan, do you
I think it might be worth making the point as well about what is this event that he's decided to boycott. It's organised by Shimon Peres once a year, the president of Israel. No one is more associated with peacemaking than Shimon Peres. That's why he won the Nobel Prize for peace. Also at the conference, these are the people he is denying himself the right to talk with and to dialogue with, will be Palestinians. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, has been a regular at the President's Conference. Palestinian businessmen attend, Palestinian NGO figures attend. So it's been a place where, despite the conflict, the two sides have managed to continue talking, hoping for better times and negotiations to come. So it's a very odd decision and very regrettable.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to mention as well the ongoing work that Shimon Peres does after he stopped being Prime Minister of Israel. Obviously, he's the president now, which is a more ceremonial position. But after he stopped being Prime Minister, he set up the Shimon Peres Peace Center, which does amazing work bringing Israeli and Palestinian young people together through sport and all kinds of other initiatives to build understanding, and does things like arranges for Palestinians who need modern high-tech medical treatment to receive that in Israeli hospitals. It's a really fantastic organisation that he's kind of dedicated so much energy to. And the idea that you would boycott a conference that's organised in the name of and indeed celebrating the 90th birthday of someone that is making that kind of contribution towards real peace and understanding in the region is very sad.
Very much so, and we've got a clip to go to now, and this is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's reaction to Professor Stephen Hawking's decision to boycott this conference in Jerusalem.
A controversial decision by high-profile scientist and Cambridge University don Stephen Hawking not to attend an Israeli conference over Palestine has drawn new fire, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling the physics professor poorly informed and suggesting he study the facts. Asked by Jerusalem Post newspaper about Hawking's boycott at a press briefing, Netanyahu said, "He should investigate the truth. He is a scientist. He should study the facts and draw the necessary conclusions. Israel is an island of reason, moderation, and a desire for peace." Described at times as the world's most famous disabled person, Hawking wrote in a letter that pressure from Palestinian academics made him withdraw from Israel's presidential conference in June. He said, "I have received a number of emails from Palestinian academics. They are unanimous that I should respect the boycott. In view of this, I must withdraw from the conference." Critics have pointed out that Hawking, age 71, suffers from motor neuron disease and relies on Israeli technology in the computer equipment he uses to function in everyday life. According to Shorat Hadin, an Israeli law center, the computer chip powering his communications equipment was designed by Intel's Israeli team. Hawking has been provided with Intel technology since 1997, and his current equipment uses the Israeli-designed Intel Core i7 processor.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alan, this is sadly Professor Hawking's decision to boycott Israel and to boycott this conference is part of a larger, wider campaign, part of the boycott, divestments and sanction campaign to delegitimize and demonize the Jewish state effectively. How has Britain become such a hub and such a center for anti-Israel activities, and how have they managed to infiltrate academia in this country?
It may be worth saying a little word about where this campaign come from to give it some context.
Absolutely.
And if we do that, we understand its nature a little bit better, I think. Some key moments. One key moment, which people aren't always so aware of, is that the old Soviet Union ran for many decades a very well-financed so-called anti-Zionist campaign, which did seek to isolate and demonize Israel. And that influenced a lot of leftists, especially around the world. Another key moment was in 2001 at the UN Conference Against Racism in Durban in South Africa, when a whole range of NGOs, often from the Third World or the Islamic world, organized themselves in advance, very well prepared, and at that conference they passed resolutions which in effect sought to make Israel into a pariah state. By the way, at that NGO conference, some people have called it an anti-Semitic hate fest. There were some terrible things went on. The protocols of the Elders of Zion were on open display for sale. The anti-Semitic forgery, which some people call it, a warrant for genocide. It was a terrible atmosphere at the conference. Many of the democratic nations walked out, wouldn't have anything to do with it. But they passed that resolution, and from around 2005, a range of Palestinian NGOs, by no means Palestinian opinion as a whole, but a range of Palestinian NGOs proposed this boycott campaign. Now, I think why Britain is central to it, a number of reasons I would pick out. One is that most of the global media hubs that really matter are in Britain. So, whether you're talking about the universities having a global reputation and academics who travel globally, or whether you're talking about the Guardian's website, which is very much one of the global media platforms now, that's very important. Just our intellectual culture and its vibrancy and its not dominance. There's many countries around the world which are very, very important, but UK is up there as particularly dominant. I think there's also something to do with the state of the British left. If anyone wants to read a book about this, I'd say read Nick Cohen's book, What's Left, which is a great book, and it's a great account of the story. And I think what happened was that too many people on the left said to themselves, well, what are we against? And they decided they were against this and against that. We're against America, we're against Israel, we're against the West, and they stopped being for anything. They stopped being for a lot of the values which you'll see in Israel, the democracy and human rights and women's freedom and so on, and liberty for minorities. And in that kind of anti-mindset, which the left has got itself into, it's created this narrative, which is that it's the narrative of goodies and baddies. Israel is the baddie and the Palestinians are the goodies. It's very simplistic, it's very unhelpful for peace, and it's something we need to move beyond. But at the moment, that's at least a view that students will come across very regularly.
No, interesting. And Luke, do you believe that Stephen Hawking is being a hypocrite in this, primarily because the actual microchip that allows him to speak, which is Intel Core 17, was designed in Israel. Plus, he's ignoring the incredible advancements in medical science and technology that Israel's actually produced.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think he's thought it through very much at all, which is odd for someone who's such a great scientist. Because of, yeah, I've already explained about the nature of the event that he has chosen to boycott, which is an event that, yeah, is one that's pluralistic and organised by someone that's that's a great champion of peace. There's the hypocrisy and the double standard around picking Israel but being happy to attend events in countries with far worse human rights records. So the technology is just one aspect of muddled thinking. I think that he's making a gesture and he's chosen an easy gesture to make, and I think it's actually almost like a kind of setup that he accepted the invitation and then turned it down in order to maximise the publicity. And I can only think that there are people from the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign that may have advised him about the orchestration of that kind of stunt. But it's yeah, the whole boycott campaign is riddled with confused thinking, false analogies with apartheid South Africa. It doesn't hold up to any kind of intellectual examination, which is why it's, you know, doubly disappointing that someone that's such a major intellectual figure would allow themselves to be associated with it.
Yeah, and Alan, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg, sadly, with Stephen Hawking, because also we've seen this year that Tom Paulin, who's a prominent English lecturer at Oxford University, reportedly compared American Jewish settlers to that of the Nazis, and he didn't face any punishment from Oxford University. Also, last year, Monte Cristo, who was an expert in conflict negotiation, was declined to speak at a conference, according to my notes, at the Manchester Mental Health and Social Care. And the only reason he was turned down was because he was an Israeli. Are we not witnessing the awful rise of anti-Semitism, which seems to be affecting academia here in Britain, and what are the consequences?
I think it's a very complicated issue. I think a lot of the people who we would think do very regrettable things and things which are very counterproductive for peace and which we think are demonizing of Israel, they would be very offended by the idea that they're anti-Semitic. And they would say, I'm not a Nazi. I know what anti-Semites are. They look like Hitler and Himmler and so on, and I'm an anti-racist. I'm not like that at all. And it's a difficult argument to have with those people, but I think what we do need to say is, look, when the vast majority of Jewish people around the world are in effect supporters of the existence of the State of Israel, and therefore are Zionists, to be comprehensively hostile to Zionism is taking you in the direction of something which some people would think of as anti-Semitic. When it's combined with a unique attack upon Israel, only upon the Jewish state, the only nation state which is expected to dissolve itself, the only ethnic nation state which is told you can't be an ethnic nation state, not the Finns, not the Norwegians, not the Greeks, only the Jewish state is told you can't be a nation state. People begin to feel, Israelis begin to feel, hold on, this is so one-sided, this is so exceptionally targeting us, what's lying behind it? So there's a real fear that anti-Semitism is at stake. I think what's going on is that it's a very simplistic analysis lies behind the BDS movement. A lot of young people tend to think of Israel and Palestine as a bit like a Wild West movie. There's goodies and there's baddies. And you can express your idealism through wholly identifying with the Palestinians and wholly opposing the Israelis. And you can understand that young people want to express their idealism. The problem is it's historically illiterate. We're not dealing with a situation like apartheid South Africa, where we have a majority which are just simply oppressed by a minority which won't give them voting rights, won't give them citizenship, and oppresses them. That's not what we have in Israel and Palestine. We have a very complicated national question. The Israeli novelist Amos Oz calls it a tragedy. It's right against right, if you want. It's two legitimate claims to a piece of land that needs to be settled by negotiation and compromise and peace and reaching an agreement. And the atmosphere the two parties need to achieve that is about trust, it's about forming links with each other, engaging, mutual recognition, and an atmosphere in which peace can be made. What BDS does is the absolute opposite of creating that atmosphere. Where we need trust, it creates mistrust. Where we need dialogue, it creates, in this case here, a refusal to dialogue, a refusal to talk, and it has counterproductive effects. It means that Israelis feel besieged. They won't take risks for peace, the kinds of risks that might be necessary to create a final solution, a compromise solution. And so it doesn't actually produce the effects that many of the people in favor of the boycott want. So to work against it, for sure.
And we've got a clip to go to now. It's entitled Crossing the 3Ds, that looks at the campaign being carried out by the boycotts, divestments and sanction campaigns that is targeting the Jewish state of Israel.
You can be pro-Palestinian without being a hater of Israel and a hater of Jews.
Not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Some of it is perfectly legitimate, and some of it and is deserving of serious discussion. But when Israel is presented as the world's greatest violator of human rights by people who whitewash atrocities being committed all around the world, then you know you got a problem.
I happen to like Natan Sharansky's definition of when it becomes anti-Semitic. He talks about the 3 Ds. If you delegitimize a country, if there's a double standard about that country, and if you demonize a country, that is anti-Semitic.
Delegitimization of Israel, someone who claims that Israel doesn't exist, and for someone who claims that the entire country should be Palestine.
Israel really doesn't meet the requirements of a legitimate state.
Hey, hey! Thank you! Ho, ho! Thank you! Hey, Israel, we gotta go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho!
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free!
Students for Justice in Palestine and Muslim Student Association are totally advocating the destruction of Israel and Israel no longer being a Jewish state on this campus.
Those who often propound a pro-Palestinian view are not talking about a 2-state solution. They're talking about a 1-state solution.
2-state solution is off the table. No, 1 state. And check this out. 1 state, majority rules. 1 state, majority rules. Us, the Muslims.
You have a double standard where other countries are doing terrible things, human rights abuses, but only Israel, the finger points to only Israel, so that it's this double standard.
I keep reading in the news about suicide bombings in Iraq, where innocent Muslim civilians will be killed by other Muslims, and also I saw that 6 gays were hanged in Iraq a few weeks ago, and yet no one cared about that here. No one was holding signs protesting that. No one was protesting the innocent loss of Muslim life. When a Muslim kills a Muslim, it's just like ho-hum. People are so used to it that they don't care about it anymore, and that's disgusting. And yet when a Jew kills a Muslim, it makes international headlines, there's protests here, and Israel is a fascist state, this and that.
And demonization. When Israel is accused of behaving like a demon, shooting children in the backs, that is anti-Semitic.
They stage die-ins and they act as if they are Gazans who are being attacked by Israel. And this is in the middle of campus, so the average person walking by obviously sees it. And they don't always question it, so they automatically see Israel as the oppressor.
You want to be shot?
Someone confronted me saying that they thought the Israeli army was the most brutal army in the entire world. And I had to respond to her saying that Israel wants peace. And the IDF has shown that it's a very humane army. In fact, during the war in Gaza, they would drop leaflets over people's homes warning them that this is where terrorists are hiding, that they need to evacuate to save their own lives. I'm not aware of any other army in the world that does this, that calls people's homes, leaving a message saying that they need to leave to protect their enemy.
Mr. President, I'm the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and I say this again, the IDF did more to safeguard the rights of civilians in a combat zone than any other army in the history of warfare.
Meanwhile, Hamas will be lobbing rockets into Sderot and other towns in southern Israel, not giving any warning, and in fact their goal is to kill innocent civilians, women, men, and children.
Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. Luke, I want to draw your attention to an extremely good article that was written this week in the Times by Daniel Johnson entitled "Hawking Has Fallen into a Moral Black Hole," in which he uses the example of Albert Einstein, probably the most famous prominent scientist of all time, who used his notoriety to raise awareness about the plight of the Jews under the Nazis and what was happening with Nazi Germany, but also to tirelessly campaign for the Jewish state of Israel. He also quotes, according to my notes here, Andrei, is it Shekhanov? Sakharov, sorry, who realised that the Soviet Union was oppressing individuals, so he fought against the oppression from the Soviet Union. And with Stephen Hawking siding with the academic boycott of Israel, is he not siding with the BDS campaign that cares more about the delegitimization of Israel and moralizing against Israel, rather than actually campaigning against the human rights abuses being carried out not only by the terrorist organisation Hamas but also Fatah as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, the tragic irony is there are dreadful atrocities being committed against the Palestinian people every day at the moment, but not by Israel. It's actually Syria is where Palestinian population is facing the worst atrocities, and the human rights situation of Palestinian population in some of the other Arab countries is also deeply troubling. No attention is being paid to that by the boycotters in general or Professor Hawking specifically. And as you point out, that Times article presents quite a sorry contrast between some of the great stands for human rights that have been made by other equally eminent scientists in the past, and the moral confusion that's at the heart of Hawking's support for boycotts. I think the aspect of this that makes me most angry is the way in which the boycott campaign is a rip-off of the anti-apartheid campaign, as in anti-South African apartheid campaign. Because I think that anti-apartheid campaign, the campaign to free Nelson Mandela and to free the black population of South Africa from subjugation, was one of the great moral causes of the second half of the 20th century. And it was one that I was proud to support as a very young person first becoming interested in politics. And it saddens me deeply that all of the language and the tactics of the anti-apartheid campaign have just been lifted off the shelf and applied to a situation in Israel which is fundamentally completely different. There is no there is not apartheid in Israel. Israel has Arab members of parliament, it has Arab diplomats, including one in the London embassy. It's a country for all of its citizens where everyone has the same right to vote and the same civil rights, and it's completely inappropriate to draw the apartheid analogy. And as soon as you debunk the apartheid analogy, then the concept of using boycotts, a tactic that was developed for the South African situation in the Israeli context, it becomes clear that that's just a rip-off and a very, very distasteful one.
And Alan, I want to draw on your expertise on countering Islamist extremism, particularly on university campuses. I mean, there was a report in the same paper in the Times that there's been a large increase in Islamic extremism on campuses, and many reported cases, including dangerous imams coming and actually inciting young, impressionable British Muslims at our university. Do you think there's a direct link between the boycott, divestments and sanctions campaign to create academic boycotts against Israel with the radicalisation that's taking place on our campuses, plus also the climate in which many Jewish and Israeli students here in Britain are in fear?
Well, there's an unlikely alliance that's happened to create the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And if we think back to the history we briefly went over before, you can see how this has come about. There's certainly a left-wing component to it, and that comes out of some of the old Soviet anti-Zionist campaigning. So some of the left-wing people who will be pro-boycott will think of themselves as anti-imperialist. They'll think of Israel as the imperialist country and the Palestinians as the resistance to imperialism. So that will be their framework, which is wholly inappropriate and untrue, by the way. The second framework will be that of the Islamists. And the one bit of history we didn't touch on was the very long-standing Arab and Muslim boycott of Israel, which went on after the founding of the state. That never really went away for a lot of people. So the contemporary Islamist movement in the UK will pick up on that aspect, which is sometimes informed by some canonical anti-Semitism, and other times informed by simply what they would call anti-Zionism. And they've both come together really behind the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. I think the thing we have to do on campuses more than anything is get into the campuses, actually turn up and have the debate. So I had an experience recently. I was on a campus in Leicester for it was called Israel Apartheid Week. So I went along to make the case, which Luke just made, I thought, brilliantly, which is that it really doesn't apply to Israel at all. And one of the things I found when I was explaining things such as Israel's always been looking to come to an accommodation and divide the land. It did so in 36, it did so in 47, it did so after 67. It tried to do that at Camp David in 2000. It tried to negotiate an agreement in 2007 and 8 at Annapolis. I could tell the audience I was giving them new information. They'd got themselves involved in a whole campaign, a whole movement against Israel. They were all for boycotting Israel and calling it an apartheid state, and they often didn't know the most basic historical facts which you need in order to understand what it is that we're looking at. So we need to get out there, we need to make our case much more clearly to a much wider range of people, and not write anyone off. I think we should understand that people can get themselves involved in movements and get wrapped up in it, but still be open to dialogue and open to debate and to be able to win over to a different position. And we should be a bit braver, perhaps, about being willing to go out there and do that, I think.
Yeah. And Luke, isn't there a great danger for students now that they're being very much brainwashed by this propaganda and end up believing lies and mistruths, which formulates their worldview, particularly when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. And therefore, aren't we losing this battle for academic freedom at our universities?
I don't think we should exaggerate the degree of support that this has got. In terms of active support for anti-Israel campaigning, there's a tiny minority of people on campus that make a lot of noise. Unfortunately, when they start operating in public spaces on campus or in student unions, they can make life very uncomfortable and unpleasant, particularly for Jewish students, but for other supporters of Israel on campus, which is one of the reasons why we can't be dismissive of them. And then there's a kind of wider groupthink that perhaps particularly people that are studying arts and humanities and political science and are kind of talking about politics, they absorb a general anti-Israel line that people that read The Guardian would also absorb, and then they carry that forward into the rest of their lives. But we've got to get out there on campus putting the alternative case. I would say the Union of Jewish Students does an amazing job educating other students about this. And part of the purpose of my organisation, We Believe in Israel, is actually to make sure that we can do this in a whole field of other arenas, not just on campus, but any civil society organisation like a trade union or the co-op or a local community group where people start pushing this anti-Israel rhetoric, we're trying to give people the confidence to be good vocal citizens and feel that they can go along to those organisations, get involved, and make just not massively complex arguments, just get the basic facts across to counter some of this. Because as soon as you start explaining to people some of the basic facts, like the steps that Israel has taken for peace, the fact that Israel's a democracy, the fact that it treats all its citizens equally, you tend to stop the anti-Israel argument dead in its tracks.
That's excellent. And Alan, I just want to also draw you to this article as well, which I thought was an excellent article, and also the comments you made earlier about Professor Stephen Hawking in his visit to Iran. And yet he had no condemnation of the Iranian regime because it's a state sponsor of international terrorism. They denied the Holocaust. The Iranian president and the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, have sanctioned the genocide against Israel and the Jewish people worldwide. Horrendous abuse of human rights, particularly amongst Christians and other minorities such as the Baha'is. And yet he's silent on this one. Isn't Professor Stephen Hawking in danger of being on the wrong side of history?
Well, I think you've made the case very well, which is any reasonably minded person would look at the countries he's decided to visit and not, while he's there, by the way, make public statements against them, but simply to go there, have his visit and come back again. And the record of Iran stands for itself. You've outlined it very clearly. And they will compare that to Israel, which has issues between its majority and minority, as every nation state does, and it's working through them. So, for instance, one of the things that's going to be the next issue of Fathom will be Trachtenberg, who's an advisor to the finance minister and is a figure who's trying to improve higher education for Israeli Arabs, is going to be announcing a program, a large-scale program, in which money from the Israeli government is matched with private sector money, and all of that money is dedicated to pushing up. 10% of the people in higher education in Israel at the moment are Israeli Arabs. They want to, and 20% of the population are Israeli Arabs. So there's a gap. This is very common with minorities in nation states. But the government is actively working right out of the Prime Minister's office to push that ratio up to closer towards 20% of Arabs into higher education. The gap between that and apartheid in South Africa speaks for itself. So yes, people have got themselves a very poor framework for thinking this issue through, and part of our job is to try to offer an alternative framework to them.
Yeah, we've got a clip to go to now that looks at the incredible technological advancements in science, technology, and also in medical research that Israel is carrying out. We've got this clip to go to now that's called Immerse, Made in Israel. Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and that clip showed some of the amazing and remarkable technological advances that all of us have had some experience in, thanks to Israeli engineering and technology. Luke, I want to bring you on this one. I mean, we discussed the boycott, divestment, sanction campaigns, the academic boycotts against Israel, and I know this is your primary job, is mobilizing people. How can our viewers who feel very passionate about Israel, they care about Israel, they want to get involved, what can they do?
Well, the easiest basic thing is to buy Israeli goods and produce and use Israeli bits of technology. And so when you go into a supermarket, ask if they've got Israeli fruit and vegetable. If you can't see it on the shelves, buy it proactively, seek it out, buy it, increase the trade links between the UK and Israel. Where there's unique Israeli products like SodaStream, why not buy one for your house? And you're helping the Israeli economy. Incidentally, that company SodaStream, that's a major Israeli exporter, is facing some really horrific protests at the EcoStream shop that they've got down in Brighton that's promoting their new green product, which just shows that kind of the nastiness really of some of the boycott campaigning. And then visit Israel. If you get the opportunity to travel there, particularly a lot of Christian viewers of this programme for reasons of faith would probably want to visit the Holy Land, and that's a great way to contribute to the Israeli economy, is to go there as a tourist. When you get the chance to enjoy Israeli culture in the UK, whether that's films or dance troupes or theatre groups or whatever, or some of the great Israeli classical and popular music that sometimes comes here, then go to those concerts and events and show your solidarity and have a good evening's entertainment as well. And then for people that feel that they're able to get a little more involved in the politics of this, it's really just keeping an eye out in all of the organisations that you're involved in. So if you're a member of a political party or a trade union or a church group or a community group, keep an eye out for anyone raising the case for boycott and speak up against it. Often just someone speaking against it is enough to stop a resolution or a motion being passed. Use the democratic structures of the organisations that you're in your everyday life to oppose any attempts at boycott that you see coming down the track.
Okay, which is really good, and I think details on the website have just come up. And Alan, I think we should end the programme on a positive note when we looked at the kind of challenges that Israel face. But Israel's got an amazing product, haven't they, in terms of their science, their technology, the breakthrough in medical science, which we're all benefiting in our everyday lives. Can you share with us how Israel's technology is really making a difference in the world?
I will do, and I'll return us right at the end back to where we began with Stephen Hawking, actually. There's a real irony here. When President Obama came to Israel recently, one of the things he was absolutely amazed by was Israeli high-tech. He was shown, for instance, mechanical snakes that can move into collapsed buildings to try to find whether anyone's alive and so on. We're talking about cameras that are so small you can swallow them now for medical purposes and so on. And people who can't walk being given artificial limbs and so on. Incredible innovation. It's called startup nation sometimes. More new companies, new technologies than any other country in the world in terms of its size. Forget its size, just as any other country in the world, only America has more startup ventures. Again, in terms of we talk a lot about the boycott campaign, but actually in the last week, what's happened? An enormous trade deal with China. Warren Buffett, the American billionaire, linking up in a major way, trying to buy and have a stake in a big Israeli company. First time his company's ever done that. And Facebook is linking up in a major way with Israel too. So we have this great potential. And here's we can broaden it out a little bit. It's obviously fantastic for the Israeli people themselves, but also many people in Israel have a vision, a dream, which is that Israel could be an economic powerhouse for the region, including for the Palestinian people. And which person, above all else, is associated with that vision of what he calls the new Middle East? Shimon Peres. That was the sign, the signature mark of Shimon Peres was, when we've settled the issue with the Palestinians, we can have borders in which we can trade with each other, we can share innovation, and we can we could radiate out this great economic powerhouse that is Israel around the region. And that's why it's so unfortunate that Stephen Hawking chose the President's Conference to boycott, because that's, again, one of the places in which not just the general aspiration towards peace, but a real practical moves towards it have been discussed every year.
Yeah. Sadly, we've got about less than a minute left of the programme. So, gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for joining me on today's programme. And, it's so important that we focus on the challenges that Israel faced, particularly in light of Stephen Hawking's decision to boycott Israel and the boycott and divestment campaign, but also to highlight the amazing achievements that Israel's achieved in which we're all benefiting. So, and thank you for coming on the programme to explain it. So hopefully our viewers will download Father magazine, because it's a very good publication, and get involved with We Believe in Israel, particularly the very interesting event that will be celebrating Israel in central London. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for joining me on today's Middle East Report. As you can see, with the issues that Israel face in terms of the academic boycott of Israel that has been advocated by Professor Stephen Hawking, that Israel is actually a light unto the nations. She's a light unto the Middle East in a region that's becoming darker. Israel stands alone in her fight and her struggle for democracy, freedom and liberty, in which Israel has an amazing, vibrant society in which Arabs are the forefront of Israeli society, serving in the media, serving in Israel's parliament, even serving in the Israeli army. So it's important that when we come to issues in the Middle East, that we stand up for Israel, we stand up for the Jewish people, we counter those lies and accusations and make a real difference for Israel. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. And we'll leave you with this wonderful song that shows the beauty and the glory that is Israel.